All right, welcome back to the Ottawa studios of Inside My Canoe Head. I am your host, Dr. D. Today, we are going to talk about political interference in preparedness. This is not an ideological-based rant, but a rant nonetheless. So sit back, grab yourself your favorite beverage. Let's get at her. Just a little high pitch there as we get ready for the incoming long weekend. I hope you have some pretty incredible plans, and I hope you all also remember that this is Labor Day weekend, brought to us by those in the labor movement that at a time in our past when people really didn't care about worker safety and the lives of workers, it was the labor movement that kept everybody alive and actually brought the reality that it's pretty cool for you to come home from work in the same physical condition that you went. Novel idea, I know, but in the past that was absolutely not a concern of management. So as we go forward today, we are talking about political interference and preparedness. This is not a rant about some ideological political party or somebody in charge. It is about the involvement of both politics and ideological frames in the movement to get or persuade the population to adopt preparedness, and the decisions that are being made in the current emergency management environment here in Canada, which probably reflect those that are happening around the world about policies and processes and regulatory frameworks put into place. Why does something as boring as policy and regulatory frameworks matter to somebody like you? Just going on, rocking your life, doing your thing, because policy is how the government chooses to set up the way and the methodology they're going to execute a task. The regulatory framework are the rules of the game, right? So if you think about preparedness, thinking about all of the things as we talk about here at Inside My Canoe Head, all of your cognitive thoughts and your physical actions that you are going to do to get ready so that when a disruption occurs, you're in the best possible situation and position to navigate it for you and your family. Now take that to society. Take that to the government level. All of the cognitive ideas and physical things that the government is going to do to position the country to be ready to respond and to deal with the significant disruption. Now I think you understand why a policy alteration of such significant nature has a lot of people in the community exceptionally concerned. This is about who is being held accountable and who is being blamed, for lack of a better term, when situations unfold that are quite expected, or that outcomes are not beautiful, wonderful, perfect, and absolutely the way that people want them to go. Welcome to life. It doesn't always work out that way. So today we want to talk about first the policy changes that we see coming in emergency management in general, and then we'll specifically get to preparedness. Within Canada, our subnational governments are the lead level of government for emergency management, right? So the way our Constitution is set up in the nation of Canada is under a couple of sections of the Constitution Act of 1982. It delineates very clearly the powers of the two levels of government, right? Between either federal or provincial, governments have responsibility and supreme authority over certain areas of ideas. So natural resources, health, education, criminal law, right? So, for example, criminal law falls under the federal government, so you can't have a criminal code of a province. It's not allowed in our country. So things fall. Now, what has happened is, as the world has evolved and life has changed, there's a whole bunch of other areas that governments are involved in that are not clearly delineated in the two sections of the Constitution. What that means is that has fallen into a model of what we refer to as cooperative federalism, which means no one level of government does not have authority over the other. In Canada, we don't have a parent-child relationship between our federal and our provincial governments. We have a cooperative model, which means each of them have a set of resources, a set of capabilities and capacities that may be brought to bear. And within emergency management, we have an exceptionally well-run governance framework. And I'm going to talk about this at an upcoming conference in Ottawa here, the Canadian conference, the Climate Adaptation, Canadian Emergency Preparedness and Climate Adaptation Conference, or CEPSA as we're calling it, at the end of October. I'm speaking in a panel with a former head of FEMA and a couple of other notable individuals talking about the Canadian Civilian Disaster Response Force. But really, I'm there to talk about governance. I'm there to talk about the fact that we have probably a world-leading model for governance structures for emergency management. The reason being is we have what's called an FPT framework. That's the Federal, Provincial, and Territorial Government Framework. It works exceptionally well. The committee structure is set up. They meet regularly. Just to give you an example, the products they put out, so this started really in 2003 post-SARS, SARS-CoV-1 that hit Canada, and we lost significant life in the city of Toronto and Toronto hospitals. And so at that time, Public Safety Canada, which is an amalgamation of all of our public security and public agencies, was created in 2003. And since then, the FPT framework, in 2008, we put out Canada's National Disaster Mitigation Strategy. In 2009, it was Canada's Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. In 2011, it was the National Emergency Response System. In 2017, it was the Emergency Management Framework for Canada. In 2019, they came out with the Emergency Management Strategy for Canada towards a resilient 2030, bringing in the Sendai framework from the UN Disaster Risk Reduction into Canadian space. In 2019 as well, they put out the Canadian Core Capability List for emergency managers. It listed 38 core capabilities that need to be present for an emergency manager to be successful. One of the first steps in professionalization. And then in 2022, it was the 21-22 FPT Interim Action Plan for the Emergency Management Framework. And finally, in 2023, they began version 1 of developing a national risk profile. So here in Canada, you can be proud of the fact that your FPT governments, your FPT framework of governments of all different ideological stripes, at the management and public service level, are exceptionally well connected, and they run the system exceptionally well. We don't have a governance problem here at the FPT level in Canada. I don't know about any other countries. I'm not really a scholar in those fields, but here in Canada, it's a model that works really well. It's important to say that first, because where we have significant disruption and where we have significant tangential moves from the FPT framework is between the provinces and the municipality. So in Canada, we have two orders of government that are formal. You have the federal and the provincial. Every single municipality that exists in a province or a territory of Canada is a construction of that province. So, for example, the City of Toronto has the City of Toronto Act that created the City of Toronto. So, by default, the provincial government could simply erase the City of Toronto as a legal entity by removing or changing the act. 100% control over everything that a municipality does in the province or in the country of Canada is controlled at the provincial level. The federal government has no direct authority or relationship with our municipalities. Now, they come into agreement on a bunch of other things. I'm not talking about funding agreements and different things like that. I'm talking about a regulatory framework. What that means is there's no common standard across Canada as how the provinces deal with the municipalities when it comes to emergency management. Now, the vast majority, and I'm not kidding, almost an exceptional high percentage of people who work in the emergency management field in Canada work at the municipal level or the regional level. They do not work at the provincial or federal level. So the mass body of community of practice are people who are working at the local level. And we all say colloquially that all disasters are local. They start and they finish at the local level. Sometimes they need inputs from higher levels or surrounding flanking levels of government, but in the end, every disaster is local. It always starts there and it always ends there. So the most impactful, you could argue, position in emergency management is the local emergency manager, is the person charged with the responsibility for readying their society, readying both their municipality and the population to deal with a known risk profile and the unknown possibilities. And then when things do occur, they deal with not incident management. They deal with incident management, not incident response. So they deal with the collective ideas and thoughts necessary to bring the society through the event and emerge out the other end. So if we understand the most influential and consequential position in emergency management, what we do is we understand that that is influenced by the provincial rules, not the federal. So we're going to take the federal government, Public Safety Canada, directly out of the rest of this discussion. Everything is about how provinces set up. Because it's cooperative federalism, there is no standard in Canada as to how the provinces set up, establish, or execute their roles. Most of them are reasonably similar in how they break up regional areas, how they have provincial emergency operation centers. Most of them follow some form of the incident command system or incident management system, as referred to in the United States. Some form of it. It's usually pretty close, but there's always some local flavors, shall we say, of that. What has happened in 3 of the provinces, and I won't name them, 2 in Western Canada and 1 Central Canada, is there has been significant recent changes inside the structure of emergency management at the provincial level, which is directly hamstringing the ability of the local and regional and municipal emergency managers to be able to respond and manage an incident, right? There's an old saying from the Army, and I'm a 28-year Army veteran, so I love pulling these out whenever I can. It is simple. There is no such thing as a task without resources, right? You cannot task me to do squat unless you assign me the resources necessary, if it's above my current capacity, right? So the theory behind that goes is if the province wants to task the municipality with executing additional functions in the world of emergency management, policy 101, like general policy, you take this in a bachelor's degree policy course, tells you must assign the requisite resources. Or your other option, if you do not wish to assign additional resources, is to remove another task that they're assigned to that would free up in idea space, would free up the resources necessary to do the new task, right? That's not being done. There has been significant additional tasks added to local emergency management in the province of not going to say the word because I'll get in trouble. But the point being is there's 3 provinces that I know of, and I'm actually actively investigating the other 7 and the 3 territories to see if they're involved in this. But basically, the tasks are being dumped down to the local level without any additional resources. And what it seems to be, when we inquire about this, now I've gone out and I've reached out to a number of my contacts that work within the senior levels of public service in the provinces and talking to a couple of people who work at the municipal level. So I've gone out and done some research and had some conversations with people off the record. And basically what it is they're downloading responsibility because accountability hurts. Because when we see things like Jasper, the wildfire in Jasper, when we see like the atmospheric river in various different areas of southern BC, when we see what's going on in after significant tornadoes went through Ontario or severe storms hit Ontario, some other prairie provinces, things like that, you see what's happening is a lot of the blame is being placed on the local government, right? The local government, they weren't prepared, they weren't ready, they didn't have the infrastructure set up, etc. A prime example, and I'll bring back the feds into this discussion, is what we see with political interference. It comes in 2 forms. The first form is your blame game. And this comes in, Jasper right now is the best example we have in Canada. What are we seeing being the football being punted around? we see the provincial government in Alberta blaming Parks Canada, a federal agency who does have responsibility for wildfire management within the national parks. And the town of Jasper is inside Jasper National Park. So all of the management of the forests around there on that crown land, federal crown land, are 100% the responsibility of Parks Canada. And according to a number of documentation and a number of public interviews that have been done, Parks Canada didn't do what they were warned about, which what is being placed forward by the politicians is had Parks Canada, now this is counterfactual, it's impossible to prove, but the counterfactual argument is if Parks Canada had done the remediation that was required due to the pine beetle overkill that was left, the deadwood, which is like firecrackers for wildfires, had they done that work, they would have been able to suppress. Now, the opposite of what the Alberta government is saying is it is because of the Herculean efforts of the town of Jasper, but all the amazing resources that the government of Alberta was able to bring to bear, and we were able to save 70% of the town of Jasper. So you have one group being called heroes and one group being labeled something different, right? The provincial government is laying blame. The federal government is then coming out saying a detailed action plan was put into place and things that were done that were reasonably could be done were done. What we don't see coming out of this, and this is a result of the political blame game that happens in the world of emergency management, right? We don't see a rapid onset investigation and startup of a task force or some entity to address all the other sites that are within national parks that are likely to have the same outcome and are sitting in the same world. Drive 2 hours south of Jasper and you're in Banff. Nobody right now is talking about the $100 million that have been set aside for work to be done, what's left of this fall and in early next spring to fix the pine beetle infestation problem surrounding Banff, right? Nobody's doing it. Everybody's concentrating effort on assigning blame and responsibility and finding the accountable human so they can fire them or do something along that lines. But what we're not seeing is that same level of effort put in the blame game, putting in trying to save our other gems in the Rockies, not just Banff, but there's all other resort towns. And if you're wondering why we worry about resort towns, number two, they're really cool. I've never been to Jasper, but I've been to Banff. I love Banff. But they're massive economic generators, right? You don't understand the value of the economic engine in some of these places to the overall community and society. Plus, we need a functioning system. And so what's happening as a result of that is you have the blame game. The second part is what I kind of alluded to first around, is the downloading of responsibilities in municipalities. Now, in most municipalities in Canada, emergency management is done off the side of the desk. And I'll talk to Ontario here for a bit where I live. There's 444 municipalities in the province of Ontario. Everything from the city of Toronto to Clara Head and something else that has like 3 employees. Every one of them are held to the same standard. It's ridiculous the way the regulation is set up right now in the province of Ontario. Everyone is held to the same standard, and everyone has to have a litmus list of things that they must be able to achieve in the regulations and must be able to attend. And the recent amendments that have come out that they're talking about is going to download in a similar model to what we're seeing in other Canadian provinces, download more responsibilities to the municipalities without the additional funding to fund the positions, right? So you're intentionally moving the ball down, putting somebody responsible who will not be able to execute the task, who does not have the resources to execute the task, but is full of incredibly well-trained and passionate individuals, right? And I've spoken to a number of them, and especially in other provinces where this has happened now, they're at the point where they're like, I'm just going to give up and go get a job somewhere else. Because it's clear the provincial government is not interested in advancing the level of emergency management oversight capability and capacity at the municipal level. The provincial governments are only interested in ensuring that accountability lies at the local level, where they've also ensured the resources don't exist, right? Because it's really good, and this is my cynicism coming out, and you can agree with it or not, but it's really good when you set up the system to where the initial response fails and you get to come in and save the day. Imagine that. Imagine what that politically makes you look like. It's a cynical point of view. I'm not assigning that as the responsibility, but as I've looked at the fundamental regulatory changes that have been made in a number of Canadian provinces in the last 3 years and strategies and plans that have been released, I don't see any other possible explanation for the decision to download massive levels of responsibility and accountability to the municipal level, to have all of these systems up and running without, let's go back to it again, without the requisite resources for them to be able to execute the task. So why does this matter to you? Wherever you live and you're listening to, we've got a great listenership in Germany. One of you, Germany has in English, it's THW. It's a local German response force that is well trained to a national standard. It's civilians that come out and help each other. I'm not going to try to butcher the German name of it, but that panel that I'm on at SEPSA this next month, we have the Canadian head of an organization looking at bringing that model to Canada as an example of how we supplement it. Why do we need to supplement it? Because we've downloaded significant additional responsibility to a level of government that wholly is inadequate and cannot do it. Not again because they lack the professional training, not because they lack the skills, not because they lack the passion or love for their community. It's because you're simply giving somebody the job of 12 people and providing them 1.5 FTE. A full-time equivalent person, right? So I'm going to give you 1.5 staffers, and I'm going to give you the job of 12, and then I'm going to get mad at you when you don't get it done to the appropriate level, right? Just that's what's happening in local emergency management. So this brings up a greater need to have the population more prepared. You need to become more prepared because the capability of your local emergency management is significantly being eroded by policy and regulatory changes in the province in Canada, and therefore it's putting your preparedness gap in a difficult position. Now, we've talked about what is a preparedness gap for the individual. Well, there is a point at which the public services end, right? Irrespective of their desire, wish, skill, capability, there is a capacity limitation on the public sector response, right? There's a point where we dial 911 and nobody will answer the phone. It doesn't matter what's happening to you, right? Because there's a point at which they get overwhelmed in a significant disruption. That's the point where it begins. The difference between that capacity stop and the need is called the preparedness gap. This is the space that you fill with your own family's preparedness decisions, right? So it's you rely, and in normal life, you rely on 911, right? Your house is on fire. You don't need a home full suite of firefighting equipment, bunker gear, SCBA, self-containing breathing apparatuses, and various other things, and hoses and pumps to fight your fire. Because in a normal situation, we've transferred that responsibility through our critical infrastructure to a fire department that we fund through our property taxes that shows up. However, in a significant disruption, when the fire capacity is consumed and there's literally nobody else to come and your home is on fire, you have a preparedness gap. So how do you address that? That's what preparedness does in the grand scheme as it relates to the critical infrastructure and the ability of a municipal government to respond. There is a limitation you pick up. As the provincial government, if this trend continues around Canada, continues to dump more and more responsibility, things like Relationships with First Nations are now being put into emergency management framework. So many different things, like, a whole bunch of bad things goes. Let's just take everything bad or disruptive that could happen in society and dump it into emergency management's basket because they're the experts. Yeah, you're not wrong. They are. Whether you're looking at a corporate world and a business continuity, or whether you're looking at a public sector environment of emergency management, they are the experts, folks. They train and are incredibly well-skilled and incredibly knowledgeable and capable of dealing with every single disruption you could imagine. You got to resource them. You have to give them the resources that are appropriate for the tasks you've assigned them. And we are breaking that cardinal rule ad nauseum, over and over again at the municipal level across the provinces. And it's being framed in these... My favorite saying is when a government comes out and says, we're modernizing. That should scare the living you-know-what out of you. When they're saying, we're modernizing the system, or we're headed towards a prepared Ontario, or something like that. They come out with this great nomenclature. They've got flashy books with pictures of people and great sayings and colloquialisms. And they put all this paraphernalia out there, all of this propaganda, let's call it what it is. And then you dig down to the actual regulatory changes, because nerds like me find this out. Most people don't really go past the cool, nice pamphlets that come out and the beautiful announcements with the boards and all the cool people in their uniforms behind the minister. When you look at the regulatory changes, you should be shocked. You would be shocked at what's being dumped into municipalities. And I'm doing this podcast today and saying these things, the quiet part out loud, because all of my friends who have the privilege of being municipal emergency managers can't do this. They can't get up to a microphone and challenge the province about their inability or what they're doing to make their job near impossible at the municipal level. They can't say this out loud, so I'll say the quiet part out loud, right? We have to stop doing things and setting up the world for failure so that somebody can look like a hero. Maybe it's a little bit over the top. Maybe I'm not wrong. Maybe I am. That's the benefit of wonderful discourse. Hopefully today you understood the mission and the rationale of this. When we think about political interference in preparedness, we think about decisions that are being made by the government that make it more difficult for agencies to do what they're supposed to do, which increases a burden placed on you, the individual. The individual that matters the most, the listeners of this podcast, you have to understand, and I've said this all along, when you look at your animalistic requirements of safety, one of them is information, right? And I talk about this in my book. I talk about it in the course. I talk about it in all of my material, that it is your responsibility to understand what your local emergency management agency intends to do in times of disruption and how they intend to communicate with you. The problem is they're getting a whole bunch of additional responsibilities that they don't have the resources to do, which will change the rules and the nature of the game. So you need to pay attention to the changes that are going to be coming, public or otherwise, or not, to your local emergency management and how they're going to do things. As they run around, and as all 444 municipalities in Ontario were ordered to have a technologically enabled emergency operations center with control groups and several levels of oversight from government, hilariously ridiculous for some tiny areas of the province, totally inappropriate, but here we go. There we are, right? So your emergency management folks are trying to follow a whole bunch of rules and regulations that do not correlate to better post-event outcomes. They correlate to assigning responsibility and blame and allowing somebody else to be the savior. You may not like it. It is what it is. But it's your responsibility to understand how your emergency management is going to act, and you need to pay attention to how these regulatory changes are going to influence that operation. So, if you do nothing else as a result of today's podcast, do me a favor and send a freaking note to your local emergency management person and just say thanks. I know we've never met. Hopefully I'll never need your services, but it's pretty cool that you're there, right? Just tell them that. Just tell them how freaking awesome they are and how much you appreciate the fact that they exist, right? Just do it. Plus, it opens up a line of communication with a pretty important person in your society. So for that, thank you very much. You got any questions, drop over to www.insidemycanoehead.ca. Drop me a line at jeff@preparednesslabs.ca. We are available on all platforms, whether you're listening it's through the website, through Buzzsprout, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podfest, or any other agencies. We have over 280 episodes. We've been on the air for 4.5 years. We're downloaded in 50 plus countries and over 900 locations on this globe. The message is preparedness. It's about getting people to understand their responsibilities, accept responsibilities for their outcome, and then leverage preparedness so they can rock an incredible life, chase their dreams, and through all of this chaotic 2020s, emerge stronger, better, and great outcomes. So take care and stay safe.